Mr. Phillips's report back up on the screen. Just a quick reminder as well, Mr. Phillips, you are still under oath.
Yes.
And go to page 4. No, page number 4, I think. Not the exhibit page number, but the number on the, sorry, I keep going down. Keep going down. There you go. Whoops. There you go, right there. Mr. Phillips, we're looking at page 4 of your report, and in bold letters it says they're the largest economic contributions from Summit's capital expenditures will occur in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Iowa in that order. So Iowa is third. Is that correct?
In terms of the gross economic output, yes.
Okay. And that's the bottom line here, isn't it?
We present several economic impact metrics in the report: employment, personal income, value added, and gross economic output. Gross economic output is sort of roughly equivalent to sales for most industries. Some people would put a lot of value on jobs and income as well.
Okay. But the economic contributions are really what your scope of work was designed to come up with, wasn't it?
Economic contributions, yes,
Yes.
in terms of jobs, income, GDP, and gross economic output. Oh, sure. One
final topic here before I quit. In the Navigator Pipeline hearing in South Dakota, they had an economist, the Navigator did, who was doing the same kind of analysis you are. But he used an economic analysis tool called REMI, R-E-M-I. Are you familiar with that?
I am.
Have you ever used it?
I have.
What I understood from that testimony was that REMI layers econometric modeling techniques onto the basic input-output modeling and models the impact of the project over time, and also has a population impact model. It's also easier to separate out the initial construction impacts that diminish over time from ongoing impacts. Do you agree with that description of REMI?
I agree with the first portion because that's directly from the way they describe the model themselves, and I think it's accurate. The second portion about, could you say the last sentence again?
Sure. REMI models the impact of the project over time and also has a population impact model. It is also easier to separate out the initial construction impacts that diminish over time from ongoing impacts.
So I would sort of dispute the last sentence because in-plan actually, I would argue, is much more transparent in terms of the way impacts occur. REMI, because it's a system of equations, has lots of secondary and tertiary interactions, which are actually quite difficult to sort out, and it's a far less transparent model.
Okay. But it is more in-depth, so to speak, in analyzing some of this data. Would you agree with that? Compared to in-plan.
In-plan is a simpler model,
okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have. Thank you. Mr. Whippel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Phillips, my name is Tim Whippel. I represent 7 counties. There you go. In your direct testimony at page 4, line 15, You explain in some detail what the in-plan model is, and you talk about the social accounting matrix. Is it accurate to say that that data set attempts to estimate secondary and tertiary economic activity?
Yes.
So generally speaking, is it accurate to think about in-plan as a tool that attempts to estimate economic ripple effects of large industrial developments?
It can certainly be used for that, yes.
Wouldn't you agree that the benefits estimated for this project through the in-plan model would also be produced by other large industrial projects?
Yes.
So in terms of the model, a similar large capital expenditure would generate a similar estimate of economic activity.
Generally, yes, with some caveats that it would have to sort of look the same in terms of the nature of the inputs that are purchased and the use of labor, but yes.
Within the same large industry classification, for example, they generally would, right? As long as we're not comparing a small retail establishment to this project, we could expect similar results. Is that right?
So in some ways, yes. The way that we actually modeled this was to build up the input purchases by understanding, purchases of pipe, lumber, all of the different materials and services that go into actually building the pipeline. But, if you had another industrial activity that had that same purchasing profile, then yes, it would have the same impact.
In your direct testimony at page 6, starting at line 1, you talk about indirect and induced effects, and I believe you already defined those for Mr. Taylor. Do you recall that?
Yes.
How much of the total impact of this project is attributable to indirect effects?
A good portion. We classify, for the capital expenditure impacts, we classify all of the construction contractors and construction employees as indirect, and that is in fact where a very significant portion of the activity sits.
When you say very significant portion, can you quantify that?
At least half, I would think.
At least half for indirect?
Yes, I believe that's true.
Okay, thank you. How much of the total impact of this project is attributable to induced effects?
I'm just estimating here based on memory, but I would say probably about a third. Because what's left is the direct effect, which would be Summit, actual Summit employees, of which, there are many, but not of the scale that we see construction contractors and businesses that support spending by employees.
So if you could, and I'm not going to do the math for you, but estimate the remaining direct effects.
No, again, this is an estimate based on my sort of rough memory of the results, but 10 to 15, maybe 20%.
Okay, thank you. What is the magnitude of error of the in-plan modeling tool?
That isn't, so in a typical, like stochastic environment, you would have a known error. In in-plan, there is no published known error. The question is how close you can align the inputs and the data in the model to the actual activity that you're trying to model.
Help me understand, is what you're saying that there's no good way to compare it to what happens in the real world afterwards?
One could go back and look, ex post at an impact and try to untangle, for instance, the effect of a given project on employment from all of the other things that are happening in the economy. That's not something that obviously we could have done for this project since it hasn't happened yet.
And the developers of the in-plan model don't do that either, is that right?
Not that I'm aware.
What is a computable, are there similar economic impact modeling tools available other than REMI? You talked about REMI with Mr. Taylor.
There are. So the basic foundation of all of these models, REMI, IMPLAN, the CGE model that you started to ask about, is an input-output matrix from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. And that's the matrix that essentially follows the purchase of inputs through the economy as it goes from one business to the next, sort of down the supply chain. On top of that, you can put other additional information. IMPLAN has the social accounting matrix. A general equilibrium model has sort of additional elasticities that are built in to reflect labor capital substitution, price adjustments, those types of things.
So good, and that's where I wanted to head, as you could tell, and you anticipated me a little bit. But just for the record, what is a computable general equilibrium model?
It is a system of equations that finds a new economic equilibrium after a shock. And the main sort of distinction between IMPLAN, which is a static input-output model, and a CGE model is the supply side effects, essentially.
So you just now characterized IMPLAN as a static model. Does that mean a CGE model is what you might call dynamic?
Yes.
And are there advantages to a dynamic model?
Dynamic models are most advantageous for policy evaluation, where you have, for instance, changes in the cost of capital or cost of production, or really significant changes in relative prices. And those are the types of dynamic effects where you would really need a CGE model.
That seems to be what we're doing here in this proceeding, doesn't it?
I don't think so.
So why wouldn't you use a CGE in this application? Why choose IMPLAN for this application?
IMPLAN is a sort of more transparent model that allows greater customization, right? So we can actually, there's no industry in REMI or some other off-the-shelf CGE model for a carbon pipeline. Within IMPLAN, we have the granularity of inputs to actually model purchases of steel and timber mats and drain tiles and all of these things that together sort of comprise the package of inputs that is what we're modeling, right? We're not simply modeling a carbon pipeline. We're modeling this package of purchases that are being made from the Iowa economy.
Package of purchases from the Iowa economy or from the regional economy?
Both.
How granular does the model develop those packages?
So IMPLAN has about approximately 440 commodity and service categories. And
in terms of geography, does it get down to individual cities and counties and jurisdictions, or does it stop at the state level?
Counties.
Stops at the county level?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, that was a bad question. I want to talk a little bit about the interpretation of results. On page 17 of your direct exhibit 1, and I actually mean page 17 by the exhibit numbering. Thank you. Here you say all of the results presented in this report are based to some degree on data provided by Summit, which has not been independently audited or validated by Ernst & Young. As such, Ernst & Young offers no opinion on the validity of the data provided by Summit. Shouldn't the board attempt to validate the data?
I have no opinion on that. As part of our exercise, because we're not engineers or construction cost consultants, we had no kind of role in validating the construction cost data.
Elsewhere here on page 17, you say that total employment figures presented in this report are not necessarily net new jobs, and that the net change in employment will likely be smaller than the gross employment impacts shown in this report. Why doesn't the report show the net new jobs?
we don't have estimates of the net new jobs. So construction workers, for instance, who would be employed on the pipe, in the construction of the pipeline, may have had another job prior to that. And so when comparing the sort of level of employment with the project as opposed to before the project, the change may be smaller than the number of people actually employed to build the pipeline.
Don't we really care in the real world about the net new jobs?
Yes. There are very few models that will give you an accurate estimate of the net new jobs, and so that's why we have this limitation in the report.
So this is the best you can do.
Yes.
On page 18 of the Exhibit 1, you say, economic output reported in this report includes double counting. Why does the report double count economic output?
Because by definition, total gross economic output, when you look at it, including direct, indirect, and induced effects, includes double counting, right? So if you have a firm that sells $100 of goods and purchases $50 from another firm, there's $150 of total transaction there, and so the total gross economic output, as would show up in every one of the models we've talked about, would include the double counting of that $50 of purchased inputs. Value added, by contrast, does not, right? And that's the distinction between gross economic output and value added.
And do you produce both of those figures in the report?
Yes.
Also on page 18, you say the gross economic output should not be interpreted as gross domestic product. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, that's actually the exact distinction I was just mentioning in the last point. Gross domestic product and value added are essentially the same thing.
Okay. What is a multiplier?
A multiplier, as generally used in this context, is the relationship between the total impact and the direct impact. So total impact divided by direct impact.
On page 18 of your direct exhibit 1, you say that the analysis is based on average multipliers rather than marginal effects. What are marginal effects?
So the in-plan model and most of the models that we've talked about are based on data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that would describe things such as output per worker, right? So for the typical worker in a given industry, how much output is produced. An expansion of that industry may have a slightly different ratio of output per worker or productivity. Our model and all of these models assumes an average for the industry, right? So, to the extent we are modeling the purchase of steel pipe, we're using the average output per worker and other sort of average industry characteristics for the steel pipe industry because we don't have any other information. Now, were there to be a sort of significant expansion of the steel pipe industry, it's possible those ratios could look different.
If that were available, would using marginal effects be more accurate?
Yes, and they could be higher.
But it would at least be more accurate.
I suppose if you knew how to accurately estimate those prospectively.
Is the analysis geographically limited, for example, to a certain distance of the pipeline corridor?
Yes. So when we built the model, as I mentioned earlier, we built it up from county level models. And within each state, the state was sort of segregated into pipeline counties where there was a pipeline alignment or a facility, and then non-pipeline counties. So the pipeline county impacts were run in a sort of multi-region framework. So input purchases from one region to another region, meaning if you had a purchase from a pipeline county of some inputs from an area of the state that did not have a pipeline alignment, those transactions between the regions would be reflected in our model. And so for each of the states in our analysis, we have one region which is pipeline counties within the state, and then we have the non-pipeline counties within the state, and that's how the models were run.
So if there's a transaction between parties in two different counties, is that where there's the double counting going on? Is it recorded from each perspective, from each county's perspective?
No. I mean, only, so for indirect impacts, employment, personal income, value added only get counted once. It's that gross economic output, which is where you see the accumulation of intermediate input transactions. And so yes, that would happen, if the two parties are in different counties or even if they're in the same county.
So just to try to summarize there, what you're saying about the double counting isn't true as to direct, only as to indirect and induced.
Yeah.
Okay. So you told Mr. Taylor that the analysis doesn't include any costs. Could you have included an estimate of total crop damage costs?
I'm not aware of such an estimate. We certainly didn't have access to one.
If Summit had provided it, would you have the tools to run it?
Yeah, perhaps.
And you could have done the same with, for example, an estimate of the cost to local governments for permitting and compliance.
Perhaps.
And the model would accommodate those things.
It's not that the in-plan model would accommodate them, but they could just be, they're sort of independent facts.
So the report could have accommodated it even if in-plan doesn't. Okay. So, but the point is, you weren't provided any estimates of costs.
That's right.
Is there any mechanism after this proceeding to verify whether these predicted effects are actually realized afterwards?
Several years from now, many years from now, after the pipeline is built, one could go back and it would require a fairly sophisticated econometric analysis to understand what actually happened in terms of employment effects and the other sort of economic impact metrics, because you would need to essentially control for changes in the economy, changes in interest rates, changes in crop prices, all of these changes in weather, right? All of these sort of exogenous variables. It's why it's not done very frequently, but it's certainly, technically possible.
In your direct exhibit, page 26, direct exhibit 1, page 26, you've included a column for direct contributions. Explain that, I guess. Is that any different from direct effects?
So those are taxes we estimate would be paid by Summit or Summit employees on their individual income.
Okay, so it is just slightly different, but it's directly attributable to Summit in the tax context.
Right.
Okay. And in the federal column, you indicate that the direct federal income taxes contributed by Summit will be $9 million during the period 2022 to 2024. Is that estimate still current?
We have slightly revised the tax estimates, although they haven't changed by much. And that particular number that you're referring to is the estimate of federal individual income tax for Summit employees. Yeah.
Right, and so that's where I was headed next. I want to be clear about that. That is the amount of W-2 withholding from employees, correct?
I believe that's correct, yeah.
It's not the corporate income tax.
Correct.
Corporate income tax is estimated to be 0.
Correct.
In the column labeled total contributions, you've indicated a distinction between direct, indirect, and induced. Let's do the same thing there as we did with direct contributions a minute ago and explain the significance of that at the top of that column header.
You mean sort of define what it means to have those three?
Yeah.
So the total contribution reflects the following. First, it reflects everything in the direct contribution column. Second, it reflects the contributions of Summit contractors, and then any vendors of goods or services, as well as the sort of incremental taxes that would be generated by businesses selling to Summit or contractor or vendor employees.
So I'm going to express to you my understanding of that, and correct me if I'm wrong. You've basically used the in-plan's ability to do indirect and induced effects to produce an estimate of the taxes paid through those indirect and induced economic transactions. Is that right?
Yes.
So let's do the same thing with the tax contributions that we did with the total economic impact a few minutes ago. How many taxes are you attributing to indirect contributions here?
The vast majority, but to indirect and induced. And between the two, indirect and induced, I would need to go back and check. I would imagine more of them are indirect than induced, but I would need to go back and check.
I guess that matters less than the bottom line. What's Summit's relative direct contribution of taxes here?
It's shown. It's a portion of the amount shown in the first block, in the direct contribution block.
Can you just read that number for us?
70 of state and local and 9 of federal.
9 federal, which is where we started. And this table is specific to the capital expenditures, correct?
That's right.
So let's flip over to table 4.3 on page 27, where we have a similar table for annual operations. Is that correct?
That's right.
And in terms of operations, the direct federal income taxes is expected to be $4 million. Is that correct?
That's right, for employees.
Right, again, from employees. And again, estimated corporate income tax is 0.
That's right. And the reason for that is because Summit isn't operating as a corporation, right, to pass through.
Well, some LLCs can choose direct taxation, others can choose pass-through, correct?
That's correct, and we are working under the assumption that Summit would choose to be a pass-through for taxation purposes.
So page 27 here, in the introductory paragraph, you indicate that the value of Summit's 45Q credits is $414 million just in 2025. Is that right?
That's right.
And is it true that those credits are claimable for 12 years?
I believe that's the case.
Do you happen to know what the estimated value is in those future years?
No.
Is it fair to assume that they'd be substantially similar, at least from operations? Well, this isn't specific to operations, is it? Is it fair to assume in the future the 45Q credits will be substantially similar?
They're based on the volume of sequestered carbon, and I believe that volume would be similar over the years. That's not something that we looked at.
You have no reason to think the volume would be meaningfully more or meaningfully less?
I don't.
Okay. So, wouldn't you agree that Summit's receiving far more in direct federal tax benefits than they're contributing?
Yes, $414 million in credits.
At page 18 of your direct exhibit 1, you say the direct property tax impact during the project operation is provided by Summit based on its preliminary estimates of operations from a specified point in time, and Ernst & Young has not independently validated the impact. So just walk me through why you didn't try to validate that impact.
So the property tax amount that we were provided by Summit, we understand KPMG had estimated. We did, although we did not sort of officially validate that amount, we did review the computation in the Excel spreadsheet that had been developed by KPMG and found it to be generally consistent with the tax rates and the property value, the PP&E value that we saw in the Summit financial model, and we adopted that as part of our result.
But did you do any independent investigation of local assessed value or local levy rates?
We did, yeah.
You did? And you did that per county?
We reviewed the property tax rates in the largest counties. I believe KPMG was using 2.58% overall as the average. And we reviewed the rates and found that to be generally consistent with what we saw.
Did you use the gross capital investment as a proxy for the assessed value?
We used the PP&E investment. We excluded soft costs, for lack of a better term. So we excluded right-of-way payments, we excluded capitalized interest and fees and those types of things.
Did the estimate factor in depreciation of that property?
This was for a point in time, so no.
So would it be fair to say that counties can't expect $1 million every year of the project, that over time the equipment will depreciate and its assessed value will go down?
It's possible that the assessed value will change. It's also likely that the assessment approach would shift to something other than cost over the future years.
So if you were a county supervisor, would you build a public budget based on this estimate?
I would expect a significant amount of property tax revenue to be generated.
How confident are you in the figure, though?
I think given the costs that we've seen that have actually escalated over the period that we've been involved in this project, it's likely that the overall cost of the project will actually potentially be higher than what these numbers were based on, which in that sense makes those numbers perhaps conservative. As to the level of confidence in terms of the actual property tax impact, I think, it's probably plus or minus 10%. Hard to say.
That's all I have for now. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Minor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Darrell Meyer, Hardin County. If we can turn to page 30 of Exhibit 1, I want to just kind of drill down into the line in Table 5.1.5, where you're talking about how this is going to impact Hardin County. And I apologize if some of these questions are a little redundant, but there's some terms on these columns. I want to just make sure I understand what they mean and help the folks in Hardin County and the board here understand what they mean. So if we look at the line for Hardin County, it's going to have a pipeline in it. Obviously, there's 35 miles of pipeline, at least that's what the chart shows. Is that right?
That's right.
And total capital expenditures This 56,706,000?
That's correct.
And that number is derived by taking the total estimated capital expenditure and prorating the number of miles that are running through Hardin County. Is that right?
So the numbers in that column reflect the sum of two amounts. One, if there's any kind of facility in the county, then the capital expenditure for that facility would be included there. And then two, yes, for the actual pipeline cost, it would be based on the mileage in the county.
And so when you talk about a facility, you mean something above ground?
Yes.
Could that be like a pump or a valve, or would this include a capture type
a capture facility? Yeah.
Okay. Now, help me understand the difference between that 56 million as a total expenditure and 65 million as a total output. Can you define total output and then explain the difference?
Yeah. So total output includes the direct, indirect, and induced effects. So I would sort of describe it as if you spend $56 million on facilities and pipeline in the county, there will be $65 million of total sales, including the value of the construction activity that's happening there, the value of supplies and materials that you're purchasing from county vendors, and then also sales of businesses that are selling to employees of the construction contractors, vendors, etc.
So how did you determine how much, let me just ask you, how much of this pipe is going to be purchased from Hardin County vendors?
The pipe itself has barely any impact in our model. I think for Iowa overall, our model estimates only 2% of the pipe value would be supplied from any vendor in Iowa.
So what constitutes the lion's share of the 56 million?
Purchases of other types of materials, the induced effects, purchase services, freight, fuel, utilities, all of the things that it takes to build a pipeline.
And so what percentage of the 56 million are going to be purchased from local contractors, vendors?
I don't have the exact percentage. I could check that and come back, but I don't
Is
have
it even half?
So overall, for materials, our model estimates statewide about a quarter of materials would be sourced from within the state. And then for services that are used in the construction process, the percentages tend to be a little bit higher, somewhere around a half.
So just to manage the expectations of the people back in Hardin County, they're going to see perhaps 28 million new dollars flowing through our economy just based on capital expenditures in Hardin County?
Of that type of expenditure, yeah.
And that is occurring, I see on the chart, some of it talks about 2025, some 22 through 24. Is this 56 million over the entire scope of the construction of the project or the life of the project?
It's over the scope, the duration of the construction of the project, which, since we did this report, has been extended to about 5.5, almost 6 years.
In the column total labor income, that's a 3-year window in this table. Has that been modified? Are those years the same?
So the construction period overall has been lengthened to, I believe it's 5.67 years. And so what was previously a 3-year snapshot in this table is now more like a 6-year, 5.5 or 6 year snapshot. The dollar amounts would be roughly the same. It's just on a per year basis. They happen, it's a smaller amount because they happen over a longer period of time.
So over that period of time during construction, there will be 22 million new dollars earned by people in Hardin County that aren't being earned right now.
That's right.
How many of those are out of town, transient, out of the area contractors, drawing a check and sending it home, not spending it locally?
It's possible that some of that money would be earned by non-residents. These numbers are establishment based, right? So if you have a business that's selling to local workers, it's possible that the employees of that business may not reside within Hardin County.
Do you know what percent of the 22 million is based on contract labor that came into the county from outside?
I don't know off the top of my head now. Sorry.
It may not be off the top of your head, but are those numbers? Do those numbers exist somewhere?
Yeah. So in our updated analysis, which is summarized in my rebuttal testimony, we do show that it's around 55% of the total construction workforce is assumed to be Iowa resident. From county to county, I'm not sure what that looks like, though.
I'll kind of jump to the column on the right, the property tax liability. And you did provide some explanation. This again is sort of just derived from a larger number in Hardin County's portion. Is that fair or not?
That's right. It starts with a state level total and is allocated based on the presence of a facility or pipeline mileage in proportion to pipeline mileage.
So even though the table here, 5.1.5, talks about property tax liability for 2025, what year would that be now if you had to update this table?
2027, I believe.
So let's assume it's 2027. Is Hardin County going to receive a check from Summit in the amount of $2,172,000 if your assumptions are correct?
Yes.
And will the county assessor have to send them a bill for that amount?
I believe there will be a central assessment process where the value will be provided to the county assessor, and then the tax levy would be set. And I believe that would be the mechanical process, but that's not something that we looked at here.
Do you know how Iowa property tax work?
Generally.
Okay. What part of what is being assessed is real property that the assessor is going to put a valuation on?
I am under the assumption that the assessment would happen centrally.
What do you mean by that? Somewhere outside of Hardin County?
Yeah.
So we got to live with whatever somebody else decides?
I believe that's the process.
Because it's not really a property tax, is it? It's a utility tax, isn't it? Right?
I think that's a fair characterization.
Will an updated table show that it's a utility tax so that you don't mislead people about what they can project and expect?
We can certainly, consider that edit.
Thank you. No other questions?
Mr. Jorde.
Yes, thank you. Sir, when did Ernst & Young get hired to do any work on behalf of Summit?
I'm not exactly sure, but I believe it would have been April or summer sometime last year.
So your report's dated April 2022. Certainly to generate a report of that length, you would have had to been hired well before that, would you agree?
Yeah, let me correct that. I think it would have been several months before that.
All right, very good. And how many millions of dollars to date have Summit or any entity working with Summit or promoting this project paid to Ernst & Young?
It has not been anywhere close to that amount.
Okay, do you include that amount in your economic analysis of the quote-unquote benefits of this project based on either induced or indirect spending, such as your fees?
No.
Okay. Now, in terms of what entities are covered, did you only analyze Summit Carbon Solutions LLC, or did you look at all of the web of Summit-related entities of what money may be spent or invested to come up with the total numbers?
So to the best of my knowledge, we're only looking at Summit Carbon Solutions LLC, but the way that the analysis was done didn't require an explicit assumption about that.
Okay. Is Ernst & Young any division or department working on R&D or research activity type credits or work opportunity credits or research or advising Summit in those regards?
It's possible.
Is Ernst & Young advising Summit in order to be able to obtain any federal or state tax incentives or grants of any kind related to this project that you know of?
I don't know of that.
Other than, you state that other numbers, so that some of the numbers were generated by Summit. I believe you talked to Mr. Taylor about that and said something to the effect that Summit used a customized model. Was that the in-plan model? Did Summit use that, or do you know what model they used?
I'm sorry, I don't recall what it was I said.
Okay, well, did you testify that Summit, you relied on Summit's numbers for a significant part of your findings here, correct?
That's right.
All right, and Summit's numbers, do you know if Summit used any type of proprietary model to generate numbers they gave to you?
I don't believe so. There were no economic impact numbers in anything that Summit provided.
In terms of wages calculation, are part of your wages numbers, do they include like proprietor fees or promoter fees that would be paid to Mr. Rastetter for his efforts on behalf of this project?
I don't believe so.
Okay. And how would you know one way or another? Did Summit break down those numbers, or did they just give you an estimate of a gross number for wages?
We had gross numbers for wages and then for benefits for employees.
Is it true that Summit did not provide Ernst & Young audited financial statements?
That's right.
And they didn't provide any audited balance sheets or equity compensation agreements?
That's correct.
And they didn't provide you with any W-2s or bank account statements to tie back any numbers or make sure to audit the numbers provided to you?
Given that all of this data is prospective, based on a project that hasn't happened yet and employees that aren't necessarily hired, I'm not sure how we could have received W-2s.
Well, but in terms of all the people that have testified they are employees of Summit, you didn't get from Summit any specific wage information for their current employees, did you?
I don't believe so.
And you didn't review or analyze any of the ethanol plant offtake agreements in preparing for this report, did you?
No.
And is the same Ernst & Young that you work for the same one that was ordered to pay a $100 million penalty for employees cheating on CPA ethics exams and misleading investigation?
I believe so.
Thank you. I don't have anything further.
Mr. Fallon?